I never believed in destiny. Not until I watched it unfold in the produce section of my local grocery store, while I was standing behind the most adorably confused man I'd ever seen, holding 2 bottles of condensed milk like they were made of solid gold.
Story based on true events. Names, locations, and some facts have been altered to preserve the privacy of those involved.
My name is Rachel, and I'm about to tell you the story of how I learned that sometimes the universe knows exactly what it's doing, even when we're convinced we're in complete control of our lives. It started on an ordinary Thursday evening, the kind where you're wearing yoga pants you haven't exercised in all week, your hair is in a chaotic bun, and you're seriously questioning every life decision that led you to the frozen food section at 7 p.m. You know the feeling. That's when I saw him. Dark hair, confused brown eyes, and a furrowed brow that suggested he was trying to calculate the atomic weight of condensed milk instead of just grabbing what he needed and moving on with his life. He was standing in my line, the line where I'd already committed to at least 15 more minutes of my evening. My cart was overflowing with the remnants of a week where I'd forgotten to meal prep and had instead chosen the spontaneous grocery shopping approach, which is just another way of saying I'd throw anything that looked remotely edible into my cart and call it dinner. Behind me, the conveyor belt was moving at a glacial pace. The cashier seemed to have entered some kind of meditative state, and this man, this beautiful, bewildered man with exactly 2 items, was standing in front of me like he was about to solve world hunger with condensed milk. I watched him for what was probably a weird amount of time, trying to figure out what someone could possibly do with 2 large bottles of condensed milk. Make flan? Start a dairy empire? Practice some kind of extreme weightlifting routine? The mystery was killing me, and honestly, it was more entertaining than anything on my Netflix queue that night. "Hey," I heard myself say, my voice cutting through the awkward silence of the checkout line. "You've got like 2 things. You should probably go ahead of me." He turned around, and I swear I saw him assess the situation with the kind of careful consideration most people reserve for choosing between a mortgage or a Tesla. His eyes traveled from my overflowing cart down to his 2 humble bottles, and then back to my face. "Oh, no, I'm good. Thank you, though," he said, with this slight accent I couldn't quite place. Brazilian Portuguese, maybe? There was something warm about it, something that made the fluorescent grocery store lighting feel a little less harsh. "Seriously," I pressed, and I'm not sure why I cared so much. Maybe it was the exhaustion of the week. Maybe it was the fact that he looked like he genuinely needed help. Maybe it was just the universe doing its thing. "I'm not going anywhere. You've got 2 items. Go. It's fine." He hesitated, and I could see him mentally wrestling with the social etiquette of cutting in line. Finally, with a grateful smile that would later haunt me in the best possible way, he accepted. As he moved forward, he turned back and said, "Thank you. Really, I appreciate it." "What's with the condensed milk?" I asked, because apparently I was that person now, the grocery store interrogator. He laughed, and it was such a genuine, unself-conscious laugh that I felt something shift in my chest. A recognition of something, though I couldn't name it yet. "Oh, I sell sweets, homemade candies. I set up at the terminal, you know, the central bus station downtown. It gets crazy foot traffic there. These," he held up the bottles, "are for a new recipe I'm trying. Homemade brigadeiro. You should come by sometime if you're in the area. The taste will absolutely convince you it's worth the trip." "I love candy," I said, and I meant it. There was something about the way he talked about his sweets, with this infectious enthusiasm, that made me want to be there when he sold them. I'll definitely come by. But I didn't. Life happened. Work piled up. The weeks blurred together in that way they do when you're an English teacher running on coffee, and the faint hope that summer vacation will eventually arrive. And gradually, I forgot about the man with the condensed milk and his mysterious brigadeiro operation. Except the universe had other plans. The universe, I've learned, has a wicked sense of timing and absolutely no respect for the concept of coincidence. 3 months later, I was at the terminal. I was exhausted. My classes had finished early, and I needed to run to the supply store downtown before they closed. I was walking through the crowded bus station, my mind already calculating how much poster board I'd need for a visual project I was planning, when I heard it. A voice calling out, asking if anyone wanted to buy some fresh sweets. That voice. I looked up, and there he was, the condensed milkman, Marcus, though I wouldn't know his name for another 10 minutes, standing behind a small table with plastic containers filled with candies that looked absolutely sinful. My heart did something embarrassing in my chest. Marcus, I called out, even though I didn't actually know his name yet. He looked up, scanning the crowd, his eyes landing on me with such a sudden, genuine flash of recognition that I felt it everywhere. You came, he said, and there was something in his voice that suggested this moment mattered to him too. Like maybe he remembered our grocery store encounter as clearly as I was suddenly remembering it now. The condensed milk girl. You actually came. The condensed milk girl? I laughed as I approached his table. That's how you're remembering me? That's how you introduced yourself, he said with a grin. You showed up at the checkout with approximately 1 million items, noticed I only had 2, and basically showed me kindness that probably seemed small to you but meant something to me that day. I didn't know what to say to that. I wanted to tell him that I'd thought about him occasionally, about his enthusiasm for candies, about the way he'd talked about his dreams with a kind of careful optimism that suggested he'd had them crushed before, but was trying again anyway. But that seemed like a lot to dump on someone in the middle of a crowded bus station. These look incredible, I said instead, leaning in to examine his wares. And they did. They genuinely looked incredible. The Brigadeiros had this glossy, professional finish. The cocoa-dusted ones looked like little jewels. There were lemon drops that caught the light, and what looked like homemade marshmallows in various pastel colors. Try one, he said, immediately opening a container and offering me a Brigadeiro. Free sample for the woman who saved me from social awkwardness 3 months ago. The moment I bit into it, I understood his passion. It was creamy and rich, with this complex chocolate flavor that didn't taste overly sweet. It was the kind of candy that made you understand why someone would wake up at 5 in the morning to make hundreds of these by hand for a bus station crowd. Oh my God, I said, my mouth still full, which was probably not the most attractive moment of my life. This is insane. You made this? I did. Well, mostly. I have to work a lot of hours to make enough to keep this going, but yeah, these are all me. He paused, and I noticed he looked tired. Not the tired of a long day, but the tired of long years catching up with you. I'm actually studying for something pretty competitive. Need flexible hours, but the candies help pay the bills while I study, so it works out. What are you studying for? I asked, already knowing I wanted to know everything about this person's story. Public service exam, he said, trying to get into a government finance position. It's a lot of work. It's been taking me longer than I thought it would, but I'm getting closer. I bought all of his sweets that day. Every single container. I told him it was for a work event, which was technically true because I did have colleagues who would absolutely demolish these at the next staff meeting, but really I was buying them because I wanted to give him a win. I wanted him to not have to stress about making sales that day. I wanted to do something that mattered. As he packed everything into bags, his hands moving efficiently through the repetitive motions of his day, I heard myself say, "My mom's birthday is next week. I'm throwing her a small party. Is there any way you could make a custom order? Just some assorted candies? I think she'd love them." His face lit up like I'd just told him he'd won the lottery. "Absolutely," he said. "I can definitely do that. When do you need them by?" "Next Saturday," I said, and immediately I was giving him my number, and he was texting me details about flavors and quantities, and somehow what had started as a chance encounter was becoming something neither of us had planned for. The week crawled by. I found myself checking my phone more than usual, waiting for his messages about the candy order. When they came, detailed messages about flavor combinations, questions about my mom's preferences, jokes about whether she liked spicy chocolate. I discovered I was smiling at my phone like an idiot. Saturday morning arrived with that particular golden light that only happens in spring. I cleaned my apartment with the kind of neurotic energy that had nothing to do with my mom arriving and everything to do with the fact that Marcus was coming over to deliver the candies. I changed my clothes 3 times. I had a small crisis about whether my apartment looked like the home of a normal person or a hoarder. I reorganized my bookshelves. I was a disaster, and I knew it. When the doorbell rang at 2 in the afternoon, I took a deep breath that did nothing to steady my nerves. He was standing on my porch holding a beautiful box wrapped in craft paper and twine. His hair was still slightly damp from what I assumed was a shower, and he was wearing a button-up shirt that actually pressed, which felt significant somehow. Our eyes met, and I saw the moment he felt it too. That strange electric current that happens when you're suddenly very aware that someone is standing in front of you, and not just a voice on the phone or a face behind a table in a crowded bus station. "Hi," he said simply. "Hi," I replied, with all the eloquence of a person who'd forgotten how language worked. "These are beautiful," I managed, referring to the box he was holding. "I wanted to do well," he said. "Your mom sounds like she deserves the best." I asked him if he wanted to come inside for coffee. Looking back, I can see exactly where the universe was nudging me. He hesitated only for a moment before accepting. We sat in my living room, the living room I'd stressed about excessively for the past 48 hours, and drank coffee that I somehow managed not to spill on myself despite my nervous state. He told me about moving to São Paulo for law school, about how he'd finished his degree and realized the corporate world wasn't for him, about how he'd started selling candies while studying for this exam that represented his real dream. He told me about his family living in another state, about how he'd made the choice to pursue stability on his own terms, rather than following a conventional path. "Most people think I'm crazy," he said, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "Spending this much time studying for an exam that might not even work out, taking odd jobs to support myself. My family worries I'm wasting my potential." "Are you?" I asked. "Wasting your potential?" He looked at me for a long moment. "I don't think so. I think I'm being patient with myself. That's not something a lot of people in my family understand. They think if you're not moving forward in the traditional way, you're moving backward. And what do you think?" I leaned forward slightly, genuinely interested in his answer. "I think sometimes you have to believe in yourself, even when nobody else does. I think sometimes the slower path is actually the right path." He paused. "Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," I said, and I meant it. When he left 2 hours later, I realized we'd talked about everything except the surface level. We'd discussed what scared us, what motivated us, what we actually wanted versus what people expected us to want. We'd laughed at stupid things and had quiet moments of understanding. We'd, almost without thinking about it, created a connection that felt substantial in a way that surprised both of us. As he walked toward the door, something shifted. The air felt charged with possibility. He turned to me, and there was this moment, one of those moments that changes the trajectory of everything, where neither of us looked away. "I should probably give you a number," he said, "in case you want to order more candies, or, in case you just want to grab coffee sometime, or dinner, or something like that." I was already saving his contact information. "Yeah," I said softly. "I'd really like that." He smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made me believe in the possibility of things working out exactly the way they were supposed to. 3 weeks later, after carefully calibrated text exchanges where we'd built inside jokes about his candy inventory and my chaotic teaching schedule, after coffee dates that turned into afternoon conversations at small cafes tucked into the corners of the city, after the kind of slow burn moments that actually mean something, he asked me to dinner. "There's this place I've been wanting to go to," he said over a text. "Would you want to go Saturday night? I promise I'm not terrible at picking restaurants." "I'm taking a risk based on the condensed milk judgment," I responded, and I could practically hear him laughing through the phone. Saturday night arrived with the kind of anticipation that feels almost painful. I changed my outfit 4 times. I did and redid my makeup. I was that person, the person who cares too much and tries too hard because something actually matters. The restaurant he'd chosen was perfect. It was intimate without being pretentious, quiet enough to actually talk, but with enough warmth in the lighting and ambiance that you felt enveloped in something special. We sat across from each other at a small table in the corner, and for the first time since we'd met, there was this almost nervous energy between us. "I'm really glad we ran into each other," he said after our appetizers arrived. At the bus station, I mean, and before that, at the grocery store. Both of those moments. "Me too," I said, and there was so much more in those 2 words than their surface meaning. I was glad for all of it. The chance encounters, the building friendship, the moments where I'd caught him looking at me with a kind of tenderness that suggested he was seeing more than just my physical appearance. I was glad for the way he listened when I talked about my students, about my dreams of maybe writing something meaningful someday, about my complicated relationship with my own family's expectations. "I know it might be fast," he continued, and now I could see he was nervous, which made my heart do something complicated and wonderful. "But I'm starting to think about you differently. I'm starting to think about us differently, if that makes sense." "It makes sense," I whispered. The dinner continued through courses that I barely tasted, through conversation that felt like discovering rooms in a house I'd been living in but had never explored. We talked about our fears and our hopes. We talked about the moments that had shaped us. By the time dessert arrived, I felt like he knew me, the real me, not the version I usually presented to the world. "Walk with me?" he asked as we left the restaurant, the evening settling into that perfect twilight hour when the city lights are starting to come alive, but the sun hasn't fully disappeared. We walked through the park near the restaurant, following paths we'd never taken before, discovering corners of the city that felt like they'd been waiting for us to find them. There was a moment where we stopped on a small bridge overlooking the water, and I became acutely aware of everything. His proximity, the way he was looking at me, the way the city lights reflected in the water, the fact that my entire body was suddenly very alive to the possibility of what might happen next. He reached for my hand, and it was such a simple gesture, but it felt monumental. His palm against mine, his fingers threading through my fingers with this careful intentionality that suggested he'd been thinking about doing this for a while. He turned to face me, and I could feel my heart in my throat. "I'm going to kiss you," he said, and it wasn't a question, but there was a gentleness in the way he said it that made it feel like a request. If that's okay? It was more than okay. It was everything. When he kissed me, it wasn't the explosive, passionate moment that movies had led me to believe a first kiss should be. It was better than that. It was slow and deliberate, like he was learning the shape of my mouth, like he was making a promise with every movement. His hand came up to my face, his thumb brushing across my cheekbone with a tenderness that contradicted the racing of my pulse. It was the kind of kiss that felt like coming home and leaving home all at once. It was the kind of kiss that made me understand why people wrote poetry about this moment, why songs were written about first kisses, why every romance novel had been trying to capture exactly this feeling of everything else in the world disappearing, except for the person in front of you and the connection between you. When we pulled apart, slowly, reluctantly, I could see my own amazement reflected in his eyes. "I've been thinking about doing that for weeks," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "I've been thinking about it too," I confessed. "Since the grocery store, probably. Which is embarrassing and intense, I know." He laughed and pulled me closer, kissing my forehead. "It's not intense. It's perfect. You're perfect. This is perfect." And standing there on a bridge over the water with the city lights starting to glow around us, and this beautiful man holding me like I was something precious and rare, I finally understood what the universe had been trying to tell me all along. That sometimes destiny arrives in the form of a confused man with condensed milk in a grocery store line. That sometimes the person you're supposed to meet is exactly the person you're supposed to meet at exactly the moment you're supposed to meet them. That sometimes when you're open to it, when you're paying attention to the small moments and the coincidences and the strange intersections of fate, your entire life can change in ways you never saw coming. I was falling in love with Marcus. Not slowly and safely, but quickly and completely, and in a way that terrified me because I was beginning to understand that I had absolutely no control over it. The universe had other plans, and I was finally, after years of trying to manage everything and control every outcome, willing to go along for the ride. What I didn't know yet was that this perfect moment, this bridge, this kiss, this feeling of everything finally falling into place, was going to be tested in ways I couldn't imagine. That the story we were just beginning to write was going to have plot twists and heartbreak and moments that would push me to the edge of who I thought I was. But standing there, with his arms around me and the promise of everything ahead, I didn't need to know that yet. I just needed to know this: that destiny was real, that love was possible, and that sometimes the universe knows exactly what it's doing, even when we're convinced it's all just coincidence. The first 3 months of dating Marcus were the kind of months that make you believe in fairy tales. They were wrapped up in stolen kisses between his study sessions, stolen moments when he'd show up at my school with candies for my students, which made me instantly the coolest teacher in the building, and late-night conversations where we'd talk about everything from our childhood trauma to our most embarrassing moments. He made me laugh until I couldn't breathe. He made me feel seen in a way that very few people ever had. But Marcus was also consumed by something bigger than us: the exam, the competitive government finance position that represented everything he'd been working toward for 2 years. Every conversation eventually circled back to it. Every plan we made came with an asterisk. Unless I get called in for an extra study session. Every evening had a timer on it because he had to wake up at 5 in the morning to study before work. I watched him carry the weight of it all, the pressure, the exhaustion, the desperate hope mixed with the very real possibility of failure, and I loved him for it. I loved him for not giving up. I loved him for believing in himself even when the odds seemed impossible. It was during one of these late-night conversations, about 6 weeks into our relationship, that he told me about his apartment situation. "The rent's going up again," he said, his voice tight with stress. "My landlord told me yesterday I can't afford it, not with my current income from the candies, and I can't take on another job because I don't have time to study." We were lying in bed at my apartment. His car was parked outside, and he'd been planning to drive to the terminal for an early morning candy-making session. He was always thinking about logistics, about how to make everything work, about how to survive while pursuing something that had no guaranteed outcome. "Stay here," I said, and I meant it completely. "Move in. You don't have to pay rent. You can focus on studying." He lifted his head off the pillow, his eyes searching mine in the darkness. "Rachel, I can't ask you to do that." "You didn't ask. I'm offering." I sat up, suddenly very awake, very certain about what I was saying. "Seriously." My mom was against it at first. And here I paused, because his family situation and my family situation were actually weirdly similar in their disapproval of unconventional choices. But she understands that I'm an adult making my own decisions. "You're struggling. I have space. I have resources. Why wouldn't I help you?" "Because," he started, but I cut him off. "Because you're scared," I finished. "You're scared of being dependent. You're scared of what it means if you accept help." "But Marcus, accepting help isn't weakness, it's trust, and I'm asking you to trust me." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "If I stay, I'm not working anymore. I'm going to focus entirely on this exam. I need to be realistic about what I can handle." "Then that's what we'll do," I said simply. "I teach. My salary covers the apartment. I'll handle the groceries and everything else. You study. And when you pass this exam, and you will pass this exam, then we'll figure out the next chapter." I could see the moment he made the decision. It was like watching someone finally put down something they'd been carrying for too long. He pulled me close and held me tight, and I felt him exhale in a way that suggested he'd been holding his breath for months. "I love you," he said, and it was the first time he'd said it. Not in the heat of passion or the rush of new relationship energy, but in this quiet, profound moment where he was allowing himself to be vulnerable with me. "I love you so much, Rachel. Thank you for believing in me." "I love you too," I whispered back. "I believe in you. I believe in us." The next 2 months were a strange kind of beautiful. Marcus moved in and completely transformed our apartment into a study fortress. He had color-coded flashcards covering one entire wall of the living room. His textbooks were stacked in careful piles on the coffee table. He'd wake up at 5 in the morning, make coffee, and spend 4 hours studying before I'd even think about getting out of bed. Then he'd have a break. We'd have breakfast together, and I'd leave for my teaching job while he went back to the books. I found myself taking care of him in ways I'd never anticipated. The night before his exam, I made his favorite dinner, pasta with the simple tomato sauce that he loved because it reminded him of his mother's cooking. I laid out his clothes for the next day. I set multiple alarms on his phone. I held him while he spiraled into pre-exam panic at midnight, telling him over and over that he was ready, that he was smart, that he could do this. "What if I fail?" he asked, his voice small and terrified. "You won't," I said with absolute certainty. "You've worked too hard for this. You're too prepared. I'm going to manifest this for you with every fiber of my being." He smiled slightly. "Can you do that?" "Already doing it," I promised. The morning of his exam, I took a personal day from work. I drove him to the testing center, kissed him for luck, and told him I'd be waiting with lunch when it was over. Then I sat in a cafe nearby and refreshed my email obsessively for 6 hours, checking my phone every 30 seconds, sending him mental waves of confidence through the universe. When he came out, I could see it immediately in his face. Before he even said anything, I knew. "I passed," he said, and his voice cracked. "Rachel, I passed. I passed." I screamed, actually screamed, and threw my arms around him, and we jumped up and down in the middle of the street like we'd won the lottery. Because in a way, we had. He'd won. We'd won together. That night, we celebrated with champagne on my small balcony, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. He kept looking at me with this expression of pure gratitude and love that made my heart ache. "I couldn't have done this without you," he said, pulling me against his chest as we stood looking out at the city. "You did it," I corrected gently. "I just believed in you while you did it." It's more than that, he said. You gave me the space to believe in myself. You gave me stability when I didn't have it. He paused, and I could feel him taking a deep breath. I want to marry you someday, Rachel. I know that's fast, and I know we've only been together for a few months, but I'm certain about this. About you. About us. My entire body went still. Did you just— Not yet, he interrupted with a smile. I'm not proposing. Not tonight, but I'm telling you that I'm going to. When the time is right, when I'm established in this job, when I can do it properly, I'm going to ask you to marry me. I kissed him then, pouring everything I felt into that kiss. The hope, the love, the sense that finally, after years of feeling like I was waiting for my life to start, it was actually beginning. What happened next was so gradual that I didn't see it coming until it was already here, already changing everything. Marcus started his new position at the government finance office about 2 weeks after passing the exam. The salary was everything he'd been dreaming of. Suddenly, he wasn't worried about making rent. He wasn't stressed about money. For the first time since I'd known him, he seemed to breathe easier. And then, very slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to change. It started small. He'd come home from work and seemed distracted, like his mind was still in his air-conditioned office downtown rather than here with me. He'd check his phone more. He'd talk less. When I'd ask about his day, the responses became shorter, more surface level. Gone were the long conversations about his feelings and his dreams and his innermost thoughts. Instead, there were sighs. There were mentions of the demanding work culture, of the long hours, of the competitive atmosphere where everyone was trying to outdo everyone else. One evening, about 3 weeks into his new job, he came home and announced he was going to an after-work event, a happy hour with colleagues at a restaurant across the city. That sounds nice, I said, genuinely meaning it. I wanted him to have a social life outside of us. I wanted him to feel integrated into this new world he'd worked so hard to enter. Have fun. Don't worry about dinner. I already ate earlier. I'll probably be late, he said, already heading to the bedroom to change out of his work clothes. Don't wait up. Okay, I replied, and there was something in his tone that made my stomach feel slightly off, but I couldn't articulate why. Take the car. Use the car. He didn't even say thank you. He just nodded and headed out, and I heard the car engine start 40 minutes later. I sat on the couch with a book I wasn't reading, wondering why suddenly everything felt different. When he came home at 2 a.m, I was already asleep. I woke briefly to the sound of him moving around, smelling faintly of cologne and something else I couldn't identify, but I was too exhausted to fully wake up, so I drifted back into sleep without really processing any of it. The next day was Saturday. I had the morning free, before I had to go to the supply store to pick up materials for the visual project I was planning for my classes. While Marcus was still sleeping, he'd mentioned something about working most of the day and being tired. I grabbed the car keys and headed out. I'll never forget the moment I opened the car door and saw it. A hair clip, a delicate sparkly hair clip with some kind of rhinestone design, sitting right on the back seat where someone's head would rest. My stomach dropped. I picked it up with shaking fingers, turning it over like it might suddenly transform into something innocent. But there was no innocent explanation for a hair clip in Marcus's car. A hair clip that wasn't mine. I brought it closer to my nose. It smelled like shampoo. A shampoo I didn't use. Something floral and expensive smelling, completely different from my typical drugstore brand. There were a few fine hairs caught in the clip too. Light brown hair, not my dark hair. Not my hair at all. For a moment I couldn't breathe. I stood there in my driveway, holding this tiny piece of evidence like it was a bomb that had just detonated my entire world. Then I smelled the rest of the car. The driver's seat still had a faint scent of that same shampoo. And the headrest. I leaned over and smelled the headrest. Yes, that distinctive floral scent was definitely there. I got in the car on trembling legs and drove to the supply store on autopilot, my mind racing. There had to be an explanation. Maybe someone had bumped into the car. Maybe a colleague had asked for a ride. Maybe, but I knew. Deep down, I knew. And the worst part was that I'd seen this coming in the slow way you see a train coming down the tracks. You know it's there, you know what it's going to do, but you're frozen and can't quite get out of the way. I spent the entire day in a state of dissociation. I bought poster board and markers and construction paper, and the cashier was saying something about my total, and I was nodding and smiling, but I wasn't really there. A part of me had already entered the space where my worst fears lived. That evening, I logged into Marcus's social media while he was in the shower. I know how that sounds. I know that this is the moment where I crossed a line, where I became the person I never thought I'd be. Suspicious, distrustful, the kind of person who spied on their partner. But I was desperate. I needed to know. Her name was Olivia. She had shoulder-length light brown hair and a smile that looked genuine and warm. She had about 300 photos on her profile, and in many of them she was wearing exactly the kind of clothes that suggested she worked in corporate finance. And she had liked at least 50 of Marcus's posts over the past month. 50. And he'd liked all of hers back. I clicked on one photo. They were at some kind of corporate event, and she was laughing at something someone had said. In another photo, there she was again, in professional attire, at what looked like a company team-building activity. And there, in that photo, was a hair clip. The exact hair clip I'd found in the car. My hands were shaking. My vision was starting to blur with unshed tears that I absolutely refused to let fall. Not yet. Not until I knew for certain. I couldn't confront him. Not without evidence. Because I knew Marcus. I knew how he would respond if I came to him with circumstantial evidence and suspicion. He would deny it. He would tell me I was being paranoid, that I was seeing things that weren't there, that my imagination was running away with me. He would make me feel crazy for even suggesting it. So I did something I'm not proud of. Something that would later haunt me during moments of quiet reflection. I downloaded a spyware app onto his phone while he was sleeping, an app that would let me monitor his messages and calls from my own phone. It felt wrong the moment I did it. My hands were shaking and my heart was racing, and there was this voice in the back of my head telling me that this was a violation, that this was crossing a line I couldn't uncross. But I ignored that voice. I told myself it was justified. I told myself I was just protecting myself. I told myself that if there was nothing to find, then there was no harm done. But there was something to find. Over the next week, I watched the messages unfold on my phone like I was reading a script of my own heartbreak. The conversations were flirtatious, they were intimate, they used pet names and inside jokes, and the kind of banter that only developed when you were spending significant time with someone. They made plans to meet, always framed as something innocent. A work meeting, an after-work coffee, a happy hour. But the language between them told a different story. And the worst part? The worst part was that he was being so careful about it. He was being secretive in a way that suggested this was intentional, that he'd made a choice to do this, that he wasn't swept up in some moment of weakness, but actively participating in deception. I felt like I was dying. I felt like someone had reached into my chest and ripped out the part of me that believed in good things and happy endings. I felt like the universe had played a cruel joke on me, letting me believe that I'd finally found something real, something that would last, only to snatch it away at the moment when I was most invested. I walked around my apartment in a daze. I taught my classes in a daze. I smiled and laughed and went through the motions of my normal life, while inside, I was completely falling apart. Marcus didn't seem to notice that anything was wrong. He came home from work, checked his phone constantly, and barely spoke to me. When I tried to engage him, he seemed irritated, like my presence was an inconvenience. He'd sleep on the couch now instead of in bed with me. He'd make excuses to leave early in the mornings. He was creating distance, and I was letting him because I still didn't know what to do with the information I had. I needed proof that was irrefutable. I needed to catch him in the act, so to speak, so that he couldn't gaslight me or convince me I was overreacting. So I waited, and I watched, and I gathered everything I could from those phone messages, screenshots, receipts, digital evidence that couldn't be argued with or explained away. 2 weeks later, I had what I needed. I waited until he left for work on a Friday morning, and then I went into action. I pulled every piece of clothing out of his closet and folded it carefully into his suitcase. His shirts, his pants, his underwear, his socks, everything. I packed it methodically, my hands moving with a cold efficiency that came from a place of self-preservation, not anger. I was numb, which was actually better than the alternative. When he got home that afternoon, I heard him open the front door and call out my name. I didn't respond. I let him search the apartment until he found me in the bedroom. "Where are your clothes?" he asked, confused. Then he saw the suitcase, packed and waiting by the bed. His expression shifted, confusion morphing into something that looked almost panicked. "Rachel, what is this?" "Go to the living room," I said quietly. My voice sounded strange to me, like it was coming from very far away. What? No, I'm not going anywhere until you tell me what's happening. I stood up and walked past him, my entire body vibrating with a rage so pure and so cold that it felt like ice running through my veins. He followed me, and I led him into the guest bedroom that had become sort of a storage space for things we didn't have room for anywhere else. And there, covering every inch of one wall, were the printed conversations, every flirtatious message, every secret plan, every lie. I'd printed them in large font, and I'd posted them like some kind of grotesque wallpaper, creating a visual representation of his deception that was impossible to ignore or minimize. "What is this?" he whispered, and I could hear the shock in his voice, the dawning realization that I knew. "This is everything," I said, and I was surprised by how steady my voice was. "This is every conversation you've had with her. This is every lie you told me while you were sleeping in my bed. This is every moment you chose to betray me." He reached for me. "Rachel, I can explain." "No," I cut him off, and the force in my voice made him step back. "You can't explain. You can't talk your way out of this. You can pack your things and leave my apartment and you never come back. That's what you can do." "Please," he said, and he was on his knees now, literally falling to his knees in front of me. Tears were streaming down his face and he was begging. "Please don't do this." It was a mistake. It didn't mean anything. I was caught up in something at work, and I wasn't thinking clearly. "Please, Rachel, I love you. I made a mistake, but I love you." "No," I said again, and there was such finality in that single word. Love doesn't come with betrayal. Love doesn't come with lies and secrets and cowardice. What you did was the most cowardly thing I've ever witnessed. You let me take care of you. You let me support you while you studied. You let me believe we had something real, something honest, and you threw that away for what? A flirtation with someone at work? It was more than that," he said, and then he seemed to realize he'd made a mistake, that he'd just confirmed the worst of my fears. "I don't want to hear it," I said coldly. "I don't want to hear any more of your excuses or your explanations, or your desperate attempts to make me feel like this is somehow not that bad. This is that bad. This is worse than bad. You had everything. Someone who believed in you, someone who sacrificed for you, someone who loved you completely, and you destroyed it." He tried to argue. He tried to convince me that I was overreacting, that we could work through this, that marriage was hard and people made mistakes. But he was talking to someone who was no longer listening. I had moved past the phase of having a conversation with him. I was now simply waiting for him to remove himself from my life. It took him 2 hours to pack his things. 2 hours during which I sat in the living room with a cup of cold coffee and didn't cry. I didn't cry until he was actually gone, until his car had pulled away from my apartment and I was finally, truly alone. Then I cried. I cried for the relationship that had been beautiful and was now shattered. I cried for the future I'd imagined that was no longer going to happen. I cried for the part of myself that had believed in love and in happy endings and in the fundamental goodness of the universe. I cried because I realized in that moment that I had no one. My family had been against this relationship anyway. My mother had never fully supported my choice to let him move in. My friends had been supportive, but not invested enough to come running when I fell apart. I was completely alone, and I didn't know how to exist in that space. The days that followed were the darkest days I could remember experiencing. I woke up and couldn't remember why I should get out of bed. I taught my classes but couldn't remember what I'd taught. I bought groceries and then forgot to eat them. I lived in my apartment like a ghost haunting my own life, unable to fully connect with anything or anyone. A week went by. 2 weeks. The hurt evolved into something different. Not quite anger, not quite despair, but a kind of emptiness that felt all-consuming. I had given everything to someone, and he had thrown it in my face. I had been vulnerable and open, and I had been punished for it. I stopped checking my phone. I stopped responding to messages from friends asking how I was. I became someone I didn't recognize, someone who moved through the world with a hard shell of protection, convinced that if I never let anyone close again, I could never be hurt like this again. It was during this time, during one of the loneliest evenings of my life, that my mother showed up at my apartment. She had let herself in with the spare key I'd given her, and she found me on the couch in sweatpants with my hair unwashed, and a general aura of despair surrounding me like a cloud of toxic gas. "Oh, honey," she said, taking one look at me and understanding everything without me having to explain. And that's when everything changed. That's when I hit rock bottom and discovered that there was actually solid ground there. That's when I started to understand that sometimes, when you're broken, you need to be remade into something stronger. And that sometimes, the worst thing that happens to you is actually the doorway to the best things that come next. But I didn't know that yet. All I knew was that my mother was holding me while I fell apart. And for the first time since Marcus had left, I finally let myself feel the full weight of my devastation. My mother sat with me on that couch for 3 hours without saying much of anything. She just held my hand and let me cry until there were no more tears left, until I was completely hollowed out and empty. When I finally stopped, when the sobs turned into hiccups and then into silence, she made me tea and forced me to eat half a sandwich. It was the most basic act of care, and it somehow felt revolutionary after weeks of neglecting myself. "Come to church with me," she said, not as a suggestion but as a command. "Mom, I'm not in the mood for a sermon right now," I replied, my voice hoarse and broken. "I know," she said simply. "That's exactly why you need to come." I wanted to say no. I wanted to sink back into my despair and stay there, because at least in despair, I didn't have to think about the future or believe in anything better. But my mother had this look on her face, a look of such gentle determination, that I found myself nodding anyway. I took a shower. I put on clothes that weren't sweatpants. I got into her car and let her drive me to Calvary Community Church on a Sunday morning when the world felt too bright and too loud and too full of things that could hurt me. The church was beautiful in a way that surprised me. I'd always thought of churches as intimidating spaces, places where judgment happened, where you had to be perfect or you didn't belong. But this one had warm lighting and worn wooden pews, and a kind of welcoming energy that made me want to cry all over again. We slid into a seat about halfway back, and I tried to make myself invisible, tried to shrink into the background so no one would notice the hollow girl sitting next to her mother. The service started with music. A worship team was singing something about grace, about redemption, about the idea that no matter how broken you were, you could be made whole again. The lyrics washed over me like water, and I found myself holding my breath, trying not to feel anything. Then the pastor took the stage. He was a man in his 60s, with gray hair and kind eyes, and the kind of presence that made you want to listen. He didn't sound angry or judgmental. He sounded like someone who understood pain because he'd experienced it himself. "Today I want to talk to you about being lost," he said, and I felt something in my chest tighten. Not lost in a physical sense, lost in the spiritual sense, lost in the sense that you've wandered so far from where you're supposed to be that you can't even remember what it felt like to be found. He paused, and in that pause, I swear he made eye contact with me. I swear he was speaking directly to me, to the broken girl in the third row who felt like she was falling through the world. We live in a culture that tells us that if we work hard enough, if we plan carefully enough, if we control everything around us, then we'll be safe. We'll be happy. We'll have the lives we want. But what happens when life doesn't cooperate with our plans? What happens when the person you trusted betrays you? What happens when everything you built comes crashing down? I was crying again, silent tears streaming down my face while my mother sat next to me, holding my hand. What happens, the pastor continued, is that we finally have the opportunity to understand grace, real grace, the kind of grace that doesn't make sense from a logical perspective. The kind of grace that says, "You're broken, and I love you anyway. You've made mistakes, and I forgive you anyway. You don't deserve this, and I'm giving it to you anyway." He talked about faith. He talked about how faith wasn't about believing that everything would work out perfectly, but about trusting that there was a purpose to the pain, that God was working in the background of our lives, orchestrating things we couldn't see. He talked about how sometimes the worst things that happen to us are actually blessings in disguise, redirecting us toward where we're actually supposed to be. When you're in the middle of the pain, he said, you can't see it. You're too close. You're too hurt. But if you can find it in yourself to trust that this wasn't a mistake, that this wasn't random, that you're being guided toward something better, then you can move through the pain instead of being destroyed by it. I sat there in that church pew, and something shifted inside me. It wasn't like a light bulb turning on. It was more subtle than that. It was like a door I hadn't known was locked suddenly opening, and light flooding in through the crack. At the end of the service, I found myself walking up to the front of the church with about 20 other people. I wasn't even sure what I was doing until the pastor was looking at me with such compassion that I felt like I was going to fall apart again. "I don't know how to believe anymore," I told him quietly. "I don't know how to trust. I don't know how to open my heart after being hurt like this." "Then you start small," he said, and his voice was gentle. "You start by choosing to believe that God is good, even when everything around you suggests otherwise. You start by choosing faith over fear, one moment at a time. And eventually, that becomes a habit. That becomes a way of living." He prayed with me. And I'm not a person who usually prays, but I found myself opening up to it, allowing the words to wash over me like medicine. By the time we finished, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. My mother connected me with a therapist the following week. Her name was Dr. Sarah Chen, and she was a Christian therapist who specialized in trauma and relationship issues. Our first session, I spent mostly crying while she handed me tissues and nodded and validated every feeling I was having. "What you experienced was a betrayal," she said to me during that first hour. "Betrayal is one of the deepest wounds we can experience because it doesn't just hurt us in the moment. It fractures our ability to trust ourselves and other people. It makes us question our judgment. It makes us wonder if we're fundamentally unlovable." "Am I?" I asked, my voice small. "Fundamentally unlovable?" "No," she said with absolute certainty. "But I understand why you would believe that right now." That's the narrative that trauma creates. The narrative is usually a lie, and our work together is going to be about recognizing when that lie is operating and choosing truth instead. Over the next 3 months, I went to therapy every week. I went to church every Sunday. I began the slow, painful process of healing. It wasn't linear. Some weeks I made progress. Some weeks I regressed and found myself angry or sad or terrified all over again. But Dr. Chen kept reminding me that healing isn't about going from broken to fixed. It's about learning to live with the breaks in a way that makes you stronger, not weaker. She helped me understand that I had spent so much energy taking care of Marcus, trying to fix him and support him and believe in him, that I had completely neglected myself. I had made his dreams more important than my own dreams. I had sacrificed pieces of myself on the altar of love, not realizing that real love doesn't ask you to disappear. "What do you want?" Dr. Chen asked me one session, about 8 weeks into our work together. I stared at her blankly. "What do you mean?" "I mean, for your life. Not for a relationship, not for someone else. For you, Rachel. What do you want?" I couldn't answer. I literally could not think of a single thing I wanted that wasn't tied to someone else, to fixing someone else, to supporting someone else's dream. "That's what we're going to work on," Dr. Chen said gently. "We're going to work on Rachel, the real Rachel, the one who exists independent of anyone else's story." It was harder than I expected. Rediscovering myself meant confronting the parts of me that I'd buried under the weight of being a good girlfriend, a supportive partner, a caretaker. It meant admitting that I wanted things, that I had ambitions, that I had dreams that had been sitting in the back of my mind for years, collecting dust. I wanted to write. I'd always wanted to write. Stories, essays, maybe even a novel someday. But I'd pushed that aside because it seemed impractical, improbable, selfish. Now I started writing again. Just for myself, just in a journal, just processing my thoughts and my feelings and my journey through this darkness into something that resembled light. I also started going to the young adults group at church. I was resistant to this at first. The idea of sitting in a room with other people my age, most of whom probably had their lives more together than I did, felt terrifying. But my mother dragged me to the first meeting, and I found myself in a fellowship hall with about 30 other people, many of whom had similar stories of heartbreak and loss, and the slow journey back to believing in good things. That's where I met David. He wasn't trying to flirt with me. He wasn't trying to catch my attention. In fact, the first time I saw him, he was helping set up the chairs for the meeting, moving them around the room with the kind of casual competence that suggested this wasn't his first time doing this. He had kind eyes and a genuine smile, and he was wearing a shirt that was slightly too big for him, which gave him an adorably rumpled appearance. "Can I help?" I asked, moving to pick up some chairs. "Oh, sure, thanks," he said, not really looking at me. Just thanking me in the kind of perfunctory way you thank a stranger in a grocery store. I don't know why, but I was grateful for that. I was grateful that he didn't seem interested in me. That made me less guarded. That made me able to actually talk to him without constantly analyzing whether he was a threat or a potential source of pain. As we set up, we fell into easy conversation. "First time here?" he asked. "Yeah. My mom convinced me to come. I've been dealing with some stuff." She thought this might help. "Dealing with stuff is kind of why we're all here," he said with a smile. "Welcome to the group of broken people trying to put themselves back together." "Is that the official name?" I asked, and I surprised myself by laughing. "It should be," he said. "We could put it on a t-shirt. Calvary Young Adults, where broken people actually feel less alone." Something about his honesty, his lack of pretense, his willingness to acknowledge that we were all messed up in some way, it made me feel less alone. It made me feel like maybe my brokenness wasn't something I needed to hide. Over the next few weeks, I started looking forward to Young Adults group. And then I realized I was looking forward to it specifically because David was going to be there, which terrified me, because I was absolutely not ready for another relationship. I was still in therapy. I was still processing my trauma. I was still learning how to exist as an independent person. But David wasn't pushing anything. We'd talk before and after the meetings. We'd grab coffee a few times. He never asked me out. He never pressured me. He just seemed to genuinely enjoy my company, and he seemed comfortable letting me take my time figuring out if I was open to anything more. "Can I ask you something?" I said one afternoon about 2 months into our friendship. We were sitting at a coffee shop, and I had been working up the courage to ask this question for weeks. "Sure," he said. "Have you ever been hurt? Like, really hurt? By someone you loved?" He set down his coffee and took a moment before answering. "Yeah, I was engaged about 5 years ago. She left me for my best friend. It was not a fun time in my life." "How did you recover?" I asked. "How did you get to a place where you could trust again?" "Therapy, faith, time. A lot of really bad days where I thought I'd never feel happy again. And then, gradually, really good days started outnumbering the bad days, and I realized that what happened to me didn't define me. It was something that happened, but it wasn't who I was." He paused and looked at me with those kind eyes. "I'm guessing you're asking because you're struggling with the same thing." I nodded, and he reached across the table and took my hand. "You're going to be okay, Rachel," he said, and I believed him. "Not because the pain will go away, but because you're going to learn how to carry it without letting it crush you. And someday, when you're ready, you're going to be able to love again without being terrified that it's going to end the same way." 6 months after that conversation, David asked me out on an actual date. He took me to a restaurant I'd never been to, and he was nervous in this adorable way that made me want to protect him, which was a new feeling. Usually I was the one being protected. Usually I was the one taking care of things. It was strange and wonderful and terrifying to be on the other side of that dynamic. "I know you're not ready for anything serious," he said over dinner, and I respect that. "I just wanted you to know that I'm interested in you. When you're ready. If you're ready. If you ever decide that you want to see where this could go." "I'm scared," I told him, because honesty had become my new policy after months of therapy. "I'm scared that I'm going to mess this up, or that you're going to hurt me, or that I'm fundamentally broken and not capable of having a healthy relationship." "Welcome to being human," he said with a smile. "We're all terrified. We're all convinced we're going to mess things up. The difference is whether we let that fear stop us or whether we move forward anyway." For the first month of dating David, I was hyper-vigilant. I analyzed everything he said, looking for red flags. I checked his phone when he wasn't looking. I ran his name through search engines looking for criminal records or evidence of infidelity. I was a complete mess, and I was aware I was a complete mess, but I couldn't seem to stop myself. It was during a therapy session that Dr. Chen finally said, "Rachel, you have to make a choice. You can either decide that David is trustworthy based on his actions and his behavior, or you can decide that everyone is a potential threat and live your entire life in a state of suspicion. But you can't do both. One of those choices leads to healing. The other leads to slowly suffocating yourself." "But what if I'm wrong about him?" I asked. "What if I trust him and he turns out to be like Marcus? Then you'll have been hurt," she said simply, "and you'll survive it, just like you survived the first time. But the cost of your self-protection is your ability to actually connect with another human being. At some point, you have to ask yourself if that cost is worth it." I started working on trusting David. It didn't happen overnight. There were moments where the old fear would spike, and I'd want to pull away, and he'd gently call me on it, asking me what I needed in that moment. Usually I just needed reassurance. Usually I just needed him to remind me that he wasn't going anywhere, that I was safe, that his love wasn't contingent on me being perfect or constantly vigilant. One afternoon, about 3 months into dating David, we were sitting on my balcony watching the sunset. He was telling me about his job. He worked in software development, which was exactly as interesting as it sounds. It wasn't. But I loved listening to him talk because his voice was soothing, and his passion for what he did was genuine. "Can I ask you something?" he said, his hand finding mine. "Always," I said. "Do you think you're ready? For something more? I'm not talking about getting married tomorrow or anything like that. But I just want to know if you're getting to a place where you can imagine a future with me. Because I can imagine a future with you, and I have been for a while, and I'm tired of pretending I don't." My heart was racing. After everything I'd been through, the idea of making a commitment to someone, even a vague future commitment, felt enormous. "I'm terrified," I said. "I know," he replied. "But are you ready?" And the thing was, I was. I wasn't healed. I wasn't over it. But I had done the work. I had gone to therapy. I had learned to trust myself again. I had faith, not blind faith, but the kind of faith that comes from surviving something and discovering that you're stronger than you thought. I had faith that God was orchestrating things in my life, that there was a plan, that even the betrayal and the heartbreak and the darkness I'd walked through had a purpose. "Yes," I said. "I'm ready." He kissed me that evening, and it was different from my first kiss with Marcus. It was slower, more deliberate, and filled with this kind of gratitude that I'd survived, that I'd opened myself up again, that we'd found each other in the midst of our brokenness. Over the next year, David and I fell into an easy rhythm. He knew about my past with Marcus. He knew that I had triggers and bad days and moments where I still struggled with trust. He knew all of it, and he stayed. He didn't try to fix me. He didn't try to convince me to forget what had happened. He just loved me through it, with a kind of patient consistency that slowly began to convince me that maybe, just maybe, I deserved to be loved this way. 13 months into our relationship, on a Saturday morning in the park where we'd had our first real conversation about vulnerability, David got down on one knee. He didn't do it with elaborate staging or a flash mob or any of the Instagram-worthy stuff that I might have imagined years ago when I thought about proposals. He just looked at me with those kind eyes and said, "Rachel, you've taught me so much about courage. You've shown me what it looks like to survive something devastating and come out the other side stronger. You've taught me about faith and resilience and the kind of love that chooses to show up even when it's scared. Will you marry me?" I said yes, before he even got the ring out of his pocket. I said yes because I'd finally learned the difference between the kind of love that consumes you and the kind of love that sustains you. I said yes because I'd done the work to become someone who could receive love instead of just giving it away. I said yes because I believed, truly believed, that God had brought me through the valley of shadow so I could experience this mountain peak. We got married 6 months later in a small ceremony at Calvary Church. My mother cried. My therapist came as a guest and cried. Even David cried when I walked down the aisle. It wasn't the fairy tale wedding I might have imagined as a younger woman. It was better than that. It was real. It was honest. It was the beginning of a marriage built on faith, on trust that had been tested and earned, and on the absolute knowledge that we were choosing each other every single day. As I stood at the altar, looking at David, I thought about the girl I used to be. The girl who had fallen in love with someone she barely knew because she was desperate to believe in something bigger than herself. The girl who had sacrificed herself on the altar of someone else's dream. The girl who had been broken in the most devastating way imaginable. And I was grateful for that girl, because she'd had to become me. She'd had to walk through the darkness. She'd had to learn that being alone wasn't the worst thing that could happen. Being with the wrong person was. She'd had to discover that faith wasn't about controlling the outcome. Faith was about trusting the process, trusting God, trusting that even when everything falls apart, you're being guided towards something better. 3 years into our marriage, we had a baby. A beautiful little girl with David's kind eyes and my stubborn streak. Holding her for the first time, I felt this overwhelming sense of gratitude, not just for her, but for everything that had led to her, for the heartbreak and the healing, for the therapy and the church, and the slow journey back to believing in good things. I thought about what the pastor had said all those years ago, about grace, about redemption. About the idea that sometimes the worst things that happen to us are actually invitations to experience something deeper, something more profound, something more real than we ever could have imagined. As I held my daughter, I made a promise to her. I promised that I would teach her about faith, not the blind faith that ignores reality, but the kind of faith that acknowledges the darkness while still believing in the light. I promised that I would teach her to trust her intuition, but also to be open to being surprised by grace. I promised that I would show her, through my own example, that you can be broken and still be whole, that you can be hurt and still be capable of loving, that you can survive the worst version of your story and still write a beautiful ending. Looking back on my life now, I realize that the journey from that grocery store line to this moment, holding my daughter, married to a man who loves me for exactly who I am, secure in my faith and my sense of self, wasn't a straight path. It was messy and complicated and painful and beautiful and everything in between. But I wouldn't change a single moment of it. Not the innocent beginnings with Marcus, not the devastating betrayal, not the months of darkness that followed. Not the therapy and the church and the slow rebuilding. All of it was necessary. All of it was part of the story. All of it led me here. So here's what I want to tell you. Whoever you are, wherever you are in your own journey, if you're sitting in a place of heartbreak right now, if you're convinced that you'll never love again, if you're wondering whether you're fundamentally broken or unlovable or too damaged to deserve something good, I'm here to tell you that none of that is true. You're not broken. You're being rebuilt. You're not unlovable. You're learning what love actually looks like. You're not too damaged. You're being refined. And if you can find it in yourself to have faith, faith in God, faith in the process, faith in your own resilience, then I promise you that there is light on the other side of this darkness. The universe isn't punishing you. It's preparing you. It's teaching you. It's redirecting you toward the life that was always meant for you, even if you can't see that yet. So have faith. Go to therapy. Read the books. Join the group. Pray or meditate or sit in silence. Do whatever you need to do to reconnect with yourself. And when you're ready, not before, but when you're actually ready, allow yourself to love again. Allow yourself to be surprised by grace. Allow yourself to believe that the best chapters of your story haven't been written yet. Because they haven't. The best is still coming. Trust me.